We did it. We won a battle hardened. For anyone who tuned into the stream, thanks for being there. It was fun to not only be featured on the Savage Feet stream, but also get to be a part of coverage for the PTI event. That was really fun. And I had a really good time with Nathan in the booth. And shout out to Nathan, leaving me with a pink foil flick flack. For anyone who didn't turn into the stream, we cracked open a cold foil Heart of Fandal. That's gotta be like top 3 moments I've had so far in the game. Super fun. So this was the list that I took down the Battle Hardened with. Of course, thanks to my team, Dylan and Ryan. So Dylan was on Kano and Ryan was on Chane. I don't have their exact lists, although if there's some interest, I could potentially get them. Nothing really too out of the ordinary. I think the only difference was Dylan was playing just extra poppers for Prism, and Ryan was on a more traditional Chane, so something more similar to the list that topped the Vegas Battle Hardened. So nothing like, the RuneGate Chane decks or things like that, just very traditional, like Swarming, Revel, Bounding Demigods, Ripbinds, things like that. So overall, all of our records today are actually really good. We didn't lose too many games, although ironically all the times I was on stream it wasn't too good for me, but outside of that I had a pretty clean record. I think I had 2 losses and a draw for the day if I'm not mistaken, so all of us played really well, and in very pivotal moments when one of us lost we were able to clutch it. One of the most important deciding factors throughout the day was finding ways to beat fatigue strategies. There was surprisingly a lot between Guardians, like we saw in the top 4 match with me on stream against the Bravo, who I beat round 1 in Swiss, but couldn't get there in top 4. But thanks to my team, we were able to get on to the finals and win. And I even played against a Fatigue Briar in Swiss. And so there was a lot of consideration about fatigue, and specifically how to beat it and what the best strategy was with the new sideboard rulings. Before, in the previous Blitz rules, you kind of just had to lose to fatigue decks. I remember back in the day with Oldham, it was completely hopeless. I think it was probably like a 90-10 matchup. I think that the Oldham would have to intentionally misplay for you to win. We're going to look at the equipment suite. So notably, we're choosing to run Tekla Plasma Pistol. The reason for this is it frees up the most amount of space. It also allows you to run a pistol plan as well as high octane. You could run something like Talishar, but that cuts into a sideboard slot, and I think pistol is fine enough anyway. You're able to run it with high octane and push for high damage turns. You're able to efficiently use 1 resource for 2 damage. And even in a format like Blitz, 2 damage is 10% of your life total. It allows you to use Achilles with it. So with 2 resources late game, you can push 4 damage, which either can push for lethal or rip cards from your opponent when they're trying to keep their grip to send back at you and drop really low on life. Goliath Gauntlet is just the standard. You just need it to push damage, 20 health format. So the overall 40 is really standard. There's nothing really interesting here if you are familiar with Boost Dash. If you're not familiar with Boost Dash, this deck is very aggressive. You're looking to just send raw stat lines at your opponent. So if you look at a card like Throttle, it's just inherently really strong because it's a 2 for 6. Dash's ability lets you start with an item with cost 2 or less in play, and so you're able to start mostly with Tekla Pounder and play on the field with 1 left in your deck. And Tekla Pounder makes it so that when you boost the first time during your turn, it's going to get +2 attack. Throttle is actually now a 2 for 8 with the Tekla Pounder buff when you boost it on your turn. And so that is a 2 for 8 with Go Again. You have 1 resource left over floating. You can just drop it into your pistol and send it to your opponent. That's only needing to keep 2 cards to deal half of your opponent's life total. If you have the Goliath Gauntlet, that can actually be 12 damage, because if you buff the Throttle, now the red Throttle comes in for 10. So you kind of get the idea. This is just a very aggressive deck. There are some pretty intricate lines as well, though. I think Dash is oddly a pretty complex deck to master. I think she's easy to pick up. She actually surprisingly has a lot of skill expression and a pretty high ceiling. Pretty high tempo card in Blitz. There's maybe some debate whether or not you should run it, but I think that in a format where you really do need to push very quickly, having a threat that forces your opponent to block with cards is really important. So if you can get Combustible Courier in the first 3 turns with Pounder and Gauntlet, you're sending a 2 for 8 that if it hits gives +3 to your next boosted attack. I still think it's fine to include in this format. The only problem though is Chane being the tier 1 deck, like the most meta defining deck. I think it's far and beyond the best deck in the format. Having Carrion Husk plus Grasp means that they can block it with 2 cards, but you have to take the Husk at some point. So I still think it's fine to run. I think it's If you actually do the math, it's not that much better than Throttle, but it forces your opponent to block it, which actually has a lot of equity in Blitz because people are just trying to race you down so quickly that if you present one value on hit that they want to deny, because they realistically should, you actually do gain enough breathing room from Combustible that you're able to set up larger turns. So I see this as more either as a card to really swing tempo and try to win the game, or more importantly, it's a card that buys you an extra turn. So this is a card that your opponent has to respect, so they have to give you cards, which means the likelihood of them being able to kill you goes lower. So what I like about the card is the fact that you can play it, and then you can have a follow-up turn usually afterwards. And normally this card also will sometimes get armor, which means that your push-through turn is normally a little bit more impactful, right? So sure, Chane can block with Husk, but that means that you're still going to get usually one more turn where now you get to push through and actually like calculate damage without them having Husk. And we're running it in blue just so it comes in for 4 on a breakpoint with the Pounder, so obviously being more difficult to block. The only consideration was whether or not to run blue high-speed impact in place of blue combustible courier. Going back, I think that the choice is pretty negligible, but after seeing how the format shook out, I do think maybe I would consider going back to blue high-speed impact. It just makes maximum velocity a little bit easier to hit, which I think is just a bit more important. I think the format, at least for this event, was a little bit slower than I anticipated. Going into the rest of the cards here, we have our big power turns. So we have High Octane, where whenever we boost, we gain an additional action point. Once again, for anyone who's new to this deck, this allows you to attack multiple times with your plasma pistol, as long as you have the resources to pay for it. The reason why is because if we get really into the fine details of rulings, whenever you attack with a pistol, it doesn't actually say once per turn attack, or once per turn action to attack. So as long as you have action points available and resources to reload the pistol, you're actually able to send it at your opponent multiple times. So what you're looking to do with High Octane is have usually a 5-card hand with it, pitch a blue, play like 3 boost cards, 2 to 3 boost cards normally, and then use all of your resources left over to shoot your pistol for anywhere up to maybe, let's say, like 3 or 4 times. I think on average it's normally about 3, sometimes you can get 4 in. It really depends on how expensive the cards are that you draw. High Octane is not a card that's good with expensive boost cards, so if you have like Combustible or Throttle, it's usually not the right time to play High Octane. It's normally when you draw like your cheaper boost cards, so your zipper hits and your 0 to 60s and T-bones, things like that. Any 1 or 0 costs in a blue is normally where you want to be with this. High Speed Impact has a really negligible on hit that I don't think in my almost 2 years of playing Dash has ever mattered, but it's there just for you to be aware of, but that's about it. It's a 1 for 4 with boost. Maximum Velocity is another really big payoff card. You're looking for a 5-card hand with this. I think it is actually impossible without Technical Core to play it on a 4-card hand, so you do need 5 cards to play it. Very powerful. It's a 2 for 10. If I didn't expect that much Prism, I probably would have ran 2 High Octanes and 1 Maximum Velocity, but I wanted an extra popper in deck. The other thing is that Blitz is such a fast format, but you do normally have at least 1 turn because of your armor. There's very few decks, especially with Chane, needing to usually set up for a few turns, and the other strong decks in the format being a little bit slower. So once you go down into it, you have Prism, you have Kasai, you have Rhinar. Rhinar is a tough one, so you kind of have to high roll this card really quickly. The thing is, you normally have about 1 to 2 turns before you're actually going to have to start blocking with cards. And if you're actually pretty careful blocking a lot early, if you think that you're in a matchup where you need to hit the maximum velocity, or you draw it early and you get a hand that doesn't work with it, if you just full block and preserve life, you normally can have a turn where you can safely say no blocks and normally get to fire it back. And if you have a good hand for it, like if you have red cards to boost, which is normally when you should play it, you probably shouldn't force it out unless if you're just really trying to close out the game or you need to rebuy tempo, like you need to get cards from your opponent. You normally want to save the max speed for when it actually makes sense to play, which is normally when it's about like 22 plus damage and it actually like rips stuff from your opponent and like really pushes a bunch of damage. But the cards, like, I think it's still like really good to run in Blitz. I think you just need a card specifically for the fatigue matchups where you can just close it out. So in all my fatigue games, which I actually did win a lot of, I think in Swiss I beat every fatigue deck I played against. I lost to the fatigue Bravo in the rematch in top 4. but it was specifically because of maximum velocity, because a fatigue deck will block you out by the time you play maximum velocity, so you have to boost 3 times. So by the time you play this, they've normally blocked out, so you just take out 10 of their health, or you take out 12 because you normally save Goliath Gauntlet for it. So being able to clear half of their health total with one card is really important, and it means if you can play both of them, you normally just win off of this card alone. So I feel like it's pretty important. Pulse Save Harpoon is just, if you are familiar with this card, you would probably understand why it's in the deck. There's nothing super out of the ordinary here. It just is a really disruptive card in a very fast format. Also with like really synergistic decks like Chane or Chane, being able to take a specific card from them can sometimes be backbreaking. It's probably the strongest card currently in Mech. Scramble Pulse was a one of inclusion. I actually was really high on this card, and I actually still think it was really good. The armor totals in Blitz are really high right now. The Warriors and Chane all being pretty well represented. And then when you hit niche matchups like, you know, Fatigue, so like Brava, things like that, anything that wants to block you out with armor. I mean, even non-Fatigue Kasai's or Dory's, this just getting like really strong value, especially in combination with T-Bones, it's just really good. I mean, I think I had a game where I think Scramble Pulse got me 3 extra life because they were forced to block with armor because I had T-Bones. And then they also, I think, had to block with Crown of Providence to filter something. And as long as you don't break the chain, so as long as you don't like use Foundry Heart or something in between it, you just get it for the entire duration of you attacking. So if you load your pistol beforehand too, then when you shoot the pistol, it still applies to your pistol shot as long as you load it before you play the Scramble Pulse. So when I did that, I think it bought me, I think like 3 life or something like that. So it was actually a 2 for 8 by itself, which is even better than like Combustible Core you're hitting. And this is something you can buff with Gauntlet and Tekla Pounder. So you can actually have this come in for 9 at the start, which is already half their life total. And it's such a good card because it means that they have to block with cards from hand. They can't just like rely on armor because they just lose too much life off of it. I don't know if I'd ever run it as a 2 of, but I definitely would stand by my decision to at least run it as a 1 of, or at least to move it to the sideboard. All right, so moving down to just the generic boost cards. These are in every dash list until maybe with Bright Lights we get better staples. These are just raw stat line boost cards. You need them for your game plan. Obviously the reds are what you want to play. You have to run the yellows just because you don't have enough cards in your card pool currently to have better options. So Spark for 0, which allows you to get a Tekla Core. It's such a, I mean, this is almost, it's not Codex levels, but it's kind of nuts, right? So you boost out your entire turn. You play Spark of Genius at the end of your turn. So after your last boost card, some means you're not shooting your pistol, that's fine. And then you get to go get a Tekla Core, which gives you 4 resources over 2 turns. And you get to redraw a new card that goes into your arsenal. And I really like playing this card when I still have Crown of Providence available, because Crown of Providence means that even if you draw a bad card, like even if you draw like a blue or something, you can just crown block immediately and you just get to redraw a new card anyway. So like the card draw from the Spark is actually like really strong, and I don't like mind when I hit something. So like in my finals, I hit a Tekla Pounder when I played a Spark for 0. I wasn't happy that I got it, but I still had Crown up, so I just like threw it in Arsenal anyway. Because you could say like, oh well, if you get stuck with a bad card in Arsenal, that's really bad from the Spark, but if you have Crown available, it doesn't really matter. So you're mostly going to use it to play Tekla Core for free from your deck. So that concludes the main list, I suppose, as I would put it. This is like what I wanted to run most of the time. The sideboard was pretty niche. So we're gonna get into probably the obvious thing here, which is what does a sideboard look like with the new Blitz rules? And specifically, why do I only have 1 chamber? So what I found from testing before the event was that having 4 items felt really bad. So for anyone who's not familiar, let me pull up a different list. So for anyone who's unfamiliar with Pistol Dash, there's a video on my channel where I cover it, but there's a secondary style of dash that exists where you run Induction Chamber as your starting item. This allows you to shoot your pistol 2 times in 1 turn because you can load your pistol, shoot it, give it go again from the Induction Chamber, which refunds the action point, and all of those are all buffed by the Purifier because the Purifier just buffs the damage for the entire turn. This is really good into slow strategies. If you play into aggro decks, you don't have the ability to play these and live long enough to ever charge up your pistol and like actually really hit them, right? Because this requires 2 cards to play, and this doesn't have go again, so you play in one of these pistol items, and then you pass this turn back to your opponent, and you don't do any damage to them, and you normally give them a bunch of cards. Into control strategies, this is really powerful because control strategies normally don't have very aggressive hands, and sometimes they can't even use all the cards in their hands. So sometimes they can't really send anything super meaningful back at you, even if you give them 4 cards to play with. Whereas if you give an aggro deck 4 cards to play with and play one of these items, you're probably in a really bad spot. So the question is like, why would I not choose to run those in Blitz? And I was at one point. So I was running 2 induction chambers and 2 purifiers. And what I found was that I didn't actually feel safe ever playing them. And the reason why is because in Blitz, you have 20 health. Even the control cards or the control decks or the decks that can fatigue you are still mostly tuned for CC. So even Blue Macho Grande from a Guardian is almost half of your health total. And so the problem was that what I found was I always need to pressure people in Blitz, because if I even take an off turn to play 1 pistol item, sometimes that can just lose me the game. Because I think we saw on stream, I had a turn where even in this version of the deck, which is much more aggressive, I had a turn where I tried to play a little bit slower to set up a maximum velocity hand against the Fatigue Bravo in top 4, and they sent a Crippling Crush at me, which in CC would be one thing. Even if I take the damage and lose cards, like, it's still fine. I still have more life total to work with. I still have, maybe I lost 2 extra cards in deck, but it's relatively okay. But in Blitz, that's more than half of my life total. And then after that, they threatened to pulverize, right? So they can kill you in just a couple turns in Blitz, even if they're a control deck. Even if they're trying to fatigue you on something like a warrior, right? With Kasai, if you just play a pistol item and pass back to them and give them 4 cards, they can play Spoils of War, Push with Sabers, they can play the attack reactions or the buffs. And then, like, what do? Do you full block now? Well, if you full block, you have the same problem where now it just goes back to them. They have full tempo. They're going to keep on ripping cards from you, and eventually you don't have a deck anymore. Or you take it, and then all of a sudden you're dead in a couple of turns. Specifically with something like Kasai, because I've also played a bit of Kasai, and I did that as well, where I would full block a dash. They would then have to take damage, essentially, because they know they're getting fatigued. And then that would give me copper, and then I could just play blood on their hands and just kill them out of nowhere, right? So if you give these decks too much room in Blitz, they'll still kill you anyway. So I felt that what I first did was I cut out 2 purifiers, because I said, well, there's no deck that plays Rampart at the Ram's Head in Blitz, so just shooting for 2 late game and ripping cards anyway from people is good enough. But then even into fatigue decks, I realized that just like having the induction chamber in deck that I had to stop and play just felt way too slow. There were some moments where I could have got away with playing it, but most of the time I didn't have that liberty. So I only ran the 1 induction chamber, and the reasoning was that late game, Dash is able to push so much damage if you hit max velocity. So there isn't this thing where like fatigue decks normally, unless if they're playing like Sunkist Sigil Bravo, most of the time, if they're just like a warrior or a deck that's just like full blocking you every turn with just 3 blocks and they have like good armor, you're normally going to get down to really tight single digit life total. So you're even if you lose, like in my experience, getting fatigued just running Tekla Pounder and having no pistol items back in the day in Blitz, I would still get my opponents to like 1 or 2 or 3. And that was with a much worse version that could beat fatigue. And the reason was just that she still outputs so much damage, you're going to push through, she just can't close it out. So having an induction chamber to late game just chip damage, even mid game just be able to chip damage into your opponent, and then late game strip a card from them and let you pistol 3 times by boosting with Achilles accelerators. So for anyone who's not familiar with these, you can just like use them. They're here to either rip a card from your opponent if you're playing against aggro. So if your opponent's like really trying to hold on to cards and they go to 2 or 1 because they just really want to keep their hand, you just use Achilles to take an extra card from them, and then that normally buys you enough room to then win, assuming you're not playing against a Rune Blade and you're not giving up Arcane Barrier and then you just die to Rune Chance, so be careful with that. But also in the fatigue decks, it lets you like get an extra 2 damage in. Basically, Achilles accelerators say pay 1, deal 2 to the opponent. So if you're playing against a fatigue opponent, They block out as best as they can. They block everything, including your pistol shot for the turn, and they drop to 2. You just Achilles, reswing the pistol, you've won the game. With Induction Chamber, you can already shoot twice every turn, and then with Achilles, you can shoot 3 times. So what I found was that in the fatigue matchups, just having the Induction Chamber threatening to chip damage unless they give an entire card was all I needed. If they block with a full card, so if they block with a 3 block, you give it go again with the Induction Chamber, and then you boost all your cards, and they already wasted an entire 3 block on your pistol, so then they inefficiently leak damage. But if they take the 2, then you're still winning the fatigue plane anyway, because now you're getting free damage in with your item. So I just found this really strong, and I didn't actually feel like I ever needed more to beat fatigue. Maybe a second Induction Chamber could be fine if you're planning on playing into more like actual fatigue decks, so like Yogi and Bravo. I don't think there's anyone else in Blitz who actually like would be classified as like a pure fatigue deck. Okay, like Battle Axe Story would also be up there, but that was it. So those came in for fatigue. Payload comes in for Prism or against fatigue, and you swap it in for Combustible Courier. So basically Payload comes into decks that want to block you, right? You would rather have a 2 for 7 into an aggro deck than a 2 for 6. But that's only if they don't block you. Because if they block Combustible Courier, it's only 4 damage, right? You don't calculate the extra 2. So Combustible Courier into blocking decks, so Warriors, Guardians, things like that, is a 2 for 4. Payload is a 2 for 6. So you just always include the payload. And also there's some niche lines you can do, like you can boost to the 0, or you can break Goliath Gauntlet, boost to the 0 or a 1 cost before. So you have to specifically break the Goliath Gauntlet before you do it, or else you close the chain and then you lose the boosted card on the chain. If you like play the boost card, Goliath Gauntlet, and then payload. But if you go Goliath Gauntlet, 0 1 cost boost payload, the payload gains the +2 from the Goliath Gauntlet, and then you have an 8 with Dominate, which is sometimes enough to also beat fatigue decks. So that's all you need, really. The last card, this is the conflicting part, is Sink Below. So Sink Below was here in addition to Null Rune Gloves, specifically for a fatigue plan into Chane. So the reasoning behind this was I was finding that in testing, if I was forced to go first into Chane, I was having trouble winning. There are ways that you can beat Chane going first, but it would basically require you to draw max velocity in the first hand or so. Either you get on the first turn and you arsenal it, or you arsenal a cheap boost card and you draw max velocity. Other than that, I think the Chane got way too much tempo going second, got way too much advantage going second, and I had trouble figuring out how to beat it. What we ended up trying and it ended up working was if you went first into the Chane, you would bring Null Rune Gloves instead of Goliath Gauntlet. So you would bring Arcane Barrier 2. You would bring in 2 Sink Belows, and you would replace High Octane and a Tekla Pounder. And if you really wanted, you would actually replace the 2 Tekla cores with the 2 payloads. So every card in your deck now blocks. And this is really important. Your only non-attacks in the deck are Spark of Genius. This is really important because of invert existence. If you are going to fatigue Chane, the way they can beat you is with an Eclipse pitch deck, or just pushing a bunch of damage in one turn you can't stop. And a big part of that is Eclipse. So invert was really big. And if you're able to never have a non-attack go to your graveyard, they can never play invert. So Spark of Genius being a yellow means you can always Arcane Barrier 2 with the Null Rune Gloves. You can always Arcane Barrier 2 the Rosetta Thorn Swing, which means that you always have a non-attack in deck. So you can never boost 3 times with Pounder. You always have to lead Pounder up, and you just always have to pitch your Spark of Genius. And as long as no non-attack hits your graveyard, you're fine against invert. What you would do is you would boost them on turn 0, consume a Tekla Pounder counter, and what happens there is that they will have to block with 4 cards, right? It's the only logical conclusion they can come to, right? It's turn 1, they're going to redraw anyway. If they take free damage on turn 0, then you just get to Arsenal and then probably win the game anyway, even if you were planning to fatigue. So they have to block with 4 cards. What that means is that now you have just, on turn 1, removed 4 cards from deck. That means that that's now 4 less cards that deal damage to you, and that's 4 less cards you have to worry about. The fatigue plan in the Chane is just surviving. If they run out of cards in deck, then you've done your job. If they've run out of cards and you have life left, you've successfully fatigued the Chane. You would run Sink Below just because you need just a few extra marginal life points, and it's just a really good arsenal target. Mid-game, essentially, once you're through with the Sink Belows, and you use your Crown of Providence, so you can throw a 3-block in your arsenal, Crown of Providence it, so you redraw a new card to block with, so then you get 5 blocking cards, which lets you block even more damage from Chane. Once you do that, your second pounder counter is normally for a red 0 to 60. You put a red 0 to 60 in your graveyard. This means that if for some reason they are actually able to play Ursa, if they're able to play Eclipse, you have a 1-card hand where you just boost into the Eclipse or the Ursa, you kill it, and then you're back on the fatigue plan. You just block everything. You never take damage. You're never sending damage. From turn after you boost on turn 0, if you're going first, you're never attacking again, unless if they actually just pass back to you. It's never okay to take damage. You have to be super disciplined with it. If you even for one turn decide to change your mind, you'll fail to do it. So it's super, you gotta rein it in. So that was the plan into Chane. Into the previous Chane list, so like the Michael Feng list, like the ones that our team played, it worked. At the Battle Hardened, the 2 Chanes I played against, I played against one regular Chane, and I went second and I won. Because the thing here is if you go second, you just play normal aggro. So you just play like this list right here, and you just hope you can outrace them. Sometimes they can still get there a lot of times they can still get there because they still gain a lot going first. When I did go first into a Chane and went for the fatigue plan, the problem was they were on the Runegate Chane. And the Runegate Chane is like a lot harder to fatigue because they make more rune chance, they can go taller on attacks. If anything leaks through, then they have the end of chain, effects that can be really punishing, right? So they can banish your arsenal, banish a card from hand, things like that. It's really tricky to play around, and I had a lot of trouble with it. I think that part of the game plan could still be fatigue if you're forced to go first, but then looking for a pivot mid game, because the exploitable part was the fact that they racked up a lot of blood debt, at least from my small experience playing into it, was that if they drop a bunch of Runegate cards in the banish zone early on, they normally can't play them all. So my opponent actually went really low. I think my opponent actually ended up at 3, even though I was fatiguing them, just because they had so many Runegate cards in banish that they just were like literally unable to play. So in the future, I probably would look for a better window to push through to try to like basically randomly steal the game, and maybe fatigue is still an option, but it's also entirely possible that you just can't fatigue the Runegate Chane, and you just shouldn't be playing Arcane Barrier 2 with these Sync Belows to try to do the strategy. Instead, you could run an Induction Chamber or Extra Purifiers for fatigue matchups like Yoji, like really hardcore fatigue matchups, or you could run Signal Jammer instead. That could be the other inclusion, is that the Runegate Chanes are like probably more susceptible to things like Signal Jammer, because it doesn't allow them to play Envelop plus Revel, or they can't play Mob Skies plus Envelop, so it limits their Runegate generators for a turn. So it could be that you just want to run Signal Jammer instead, or you could just include the card and just be aggressive into them anyway, but use that as a disruptive tool that you can get off Spark of Genius. So that was the overall deck tech. I hope it was helpful for people. Basically, this is just an aggro deck that has some tools for fatigue, and then was trying to find an answer for Chane. I think that the answer for Chane was not entirely solved, and it could just be that either the fatigue plan needs to change a bit for the new versions of Chane you have to account for, or that you actually just need to be fully aggro into them, even if you're forced to go first, and you have to find better tech cards. So perhaps, you have things like Signal Jammer, Warmongers. There could be other alternatives as well. So yeah, really happy with the tournament run, of course. We all had a really great record for the day. Got to come home with a gold foil flick knife. So I have something really awesome to show off from now on. So yeah, until next time, thank you for watching.